Almost everyone wants to start a podcast, but not enough people ask themselves, why are people tuning in to podcasts? What are the reasons behind listening to someone's show versus another podcast? Why is it that they decide to hit subscribe? Why do they keep that person next to them every single week? And why does that become part of their routine? Well, this podcast episode is going to be uncovering all of these questions. We're going to break down the 2 reasons why people listen to podcasts, the pros and cons of each. And if you're looking at understanding and getting behind the mindset of listeners, well, you got to stay until the end because I'm going to be releasing a few interesting tips for you to think about. So I want to make sure that as a podcast host, you have the information that you need to create a successful and strategic show that stands the test of time, but that also helps you reach your podcast goals. Hi, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of The Podcast Space, a show dedicated to help impact-driven entrepreneurs, minorities, women, and multilinguals to harness the power of podcasting to stand out online and make all of their dreams come true. Let's dive right into the episode. Okay, why the heck am I talking about this? Well, not understanding why people listen to podcasts is one of the top 3 reasons why most podcasters fail, and followed by these 2 elements, which is the first one is having absolutely no clarity what you personally want out of these podcasts, which leads to overwhelm because there's just a lot of decision fatigue. And the third is that they can't see results fast enough, and so they kind of lose interest in the show. So I wanted you understand why people want to listen to podcasts. And that's down to 2 reasons. Number 1, they have an interest in the topic, so it's topic driven. And number 2, they have an interest in the person. It's personality driven. And understanding the difference between these 2 is going to be the most strategic decision that you can ever make, whether you're just starting a podcast or if you're looking around and you're like, why is this podcast not working, right? So we need to get our heads inside our listener heads or any person in general. So let's start with personality. So when people listen to podcasts, and the way that I'm going to describe these 2 reasons why, I'm going to be combining both from the perspective of the audience, but also as hosts and kind of the pros and cons. So what are the characteristics of a personality show? So basically, as the listener, you're there to like socialize, quote unquote, even though it's like kind of almost like one way, but you're feeling like you're a fly in the wall in this person's life. It's like a parasocial relationship. And so this type of podcast, like for instance, like Anything Goes with Emma Chamberlain, Celebrity, or any like name-led show. So if I was to call this the Anna Xavier show, people would probably expect that it's about my life. It's obvious that it's centered about the person. And so it's not necessarily, number 1, tied to knowledge or expertise in any way, shape, or form. So there's less pressure on the host side. Like you're not, you don't have qualifications about your own life. You're just talking about it, right? The episodes tend to be self-contained, really like train of thought. You don't need to plan it. It's a bit more free. It's just like, especially if you're documenting what is going on in your life or what's happening in the world. There's not necessarily an audience avatar per se, so the people tuning into shows have really varied backgrounds because, again, there's very few consistent elements, right? Like you're talking about everything and anything. So it's a little harder to draw some parallels between the interests of these people. Another element to consider is that if you want to monetize, the audience already has some expectations about this podcast being the product. And, merch is something that you probably would be thinking about, like making merch to sell to the audience to create kind of like a community. Also, affiliate marketing is quite big in this field. So people kind of like listen to you, and if you're thinking about like lifestyle brands, right, like mattresses, food, experiences, and travel, those would be more generic. And the emphasis really is on the host's personality and charisma. So we get to know them almost as friends, and it's like a shared experience of, what is going on. And let's dive into the pros and cons, because this is where the nitty-gritty happens, and that's where most people get it wrong when thinking about a type of show and then picking one of these 2 and then being disappointed that the audience isn't doing what they think the audience should be doing. So here are the pros of this type of show. We have absolutely 100% freedom on this topic. If you want, you can pick one thing that you like get mad about or you love. So like gossip, or if it is like traveling, or if it is celebrity stuff. So these don't require you to have a specific thing that you talk about. So it allows itself to be experimental. There's no expertise required, which is a pro, right? Like you don't need to know anything about anything. It's just talking. It's more forgiving on a technical level. This type of format that normally is also like just longer because it's just more conversational. It's less edited. It tends to be less structured. So if you like that format, it would be great, and audiences expect that too. So the more human, raw, and controversial content, the better. So these audiences are craving thoughts. These audiences are craving moments. So if you have no opinions on anything, if you're not willing to kind of like own the seat of the host to become a personality, this show is probably not going to work for you. But if you are seeking that, you can. And this type of show is really notorious for something. If you want to be anonymous, you can. You can have a really successful show being an anonymous host, which also means it can be what I call a burner show. It can be something that is like temporarily happening in your life. And so what are some of the cons that it also comes with? So the cons of having a personality show is that it lies on the host's ability to carry a topic and conversation. So when you are the host, you really need to own the seat. And if you have a show that is interview-based, well, you know, it has to be content that people want to stay in, and it has to be content that they're like entertained by. So entertained or inspired, but like really when we're listening to a show, the host normally tends to be doing solo episodes, but they have to create that connection with this person that they don't really know anything about, which is kind of hard. And so following on that same train of thought, it's going to be hard when you have no idea why should anyone listen. So it's really hard not only to pitch it and to market it, but to come up with topic ideas and to figure out like what's actually landing. And this is where it's important, if you already have this type of show, to go into your analytics and figure out like what are the nuances, what are the topics, what was the energy of that specific episode that really overall tends to bring more people. And last but not least, low or minimal way to transfer your audiences into paying customers or to build your influence, to overlap the audience needs and wants and where they're willing to spend money and your ideal customer, right? Like there's a very minimal overlap. So the next one, the topic. People subscribe to these podcasts because they want to learn or to be inspired or to eventually take action, and they're kind of like cementing their knowledge on something. But a few examples of this is this podcast itself, the podcast space. There's another podcast which is called 99% Invisible, super known, and anything that Adam Grant does on behavior and company culture and things like that. What is about these podcasts that make people listen? So baseline knowledge level. So you know if you've done your marketing well, and if you follow these podcasts and you've listened to more than just this episode, you know that creating a podcast that is very obvious from the standpoint of the listener experience, that keywords are there, the title is very descriptive, the content is not clickbaity, so you do deliver on what you're promising. That is the reason why people would pick a show, right? Like in terms of audience avatars, these types of shows tend to be very focused. So basically the type of people who are listening to the show have a lot of similar characteristics. So while they're seeking, the type of person they are, the type of outcomes that they're looking for, the type of expertise level that they already have and what they're trying to get to. All of these elements, like how they live life, their ideals, all of these are connected elements. In terms of topics, these tend to be very contained. And that's where it's hard to pivot a podcast if you've been doing a podcast for a while, because the audience expects a specific type of expertise level, a specific type of content. So when we're looking at monetization, the audience doesn't necessarily always expect to be monetized. So the way that we're normally monetizing a podcast like this is through selling products and services that we have, or to have opportunities through these meaningful relationships that we're having by like the guests being on the show. So the idea is that the audience is listening to it because they're like, I have a question and you have an answer and I want to learn from it, right? So it's not necessarily that I know that I will buy your products and services, but I know that if I want to, that's an option, right? So as a host, you understand exactly what the audience wants and needs, which is helpful for creating an effective communication plan, strategy plan. Therefore, you can make decisions based on how do you personally help these people get there. So the traditional media, the traditional ways to promote a podcast like newsletters, podcast guesting, social media, blogs and all, like that's the kind of thing that will help additionally to word of mouth. Now, I do want to make sure that you understand that when we're looking at using the podcast on a topic, we're going to be a little more structured in the way of the format and, of course, on the topic. But when we're looking at expertise, we normally by default need to have some sort of expertise or credentials to be talking about this. So also, the expectation on the listener level, if they're thinking that you know exactly what you want to talk about, they're also expecting the technical level to be a little more tight if it was for like a podcast about everything and anything. And when you have the reason people listening being that they want to learn about a topic, normally being anonymous is not necessarily a possibility. So you're going to be able to elevate your brand. So overall, like that's a plus, right? And it's something that when you're considering what these podcasts should be, I would suggest that you really lean into like how you're learning and not necessarily like judging yourself. So I want to also just invite you to think about the fact that even though you're expected to have a little bit more like grip on these elements that I'm talking about, that's no excuse for you to not do a podcast that is exciting. And so thinking about like exactly what's the purpose of this one episode that I'm creating, that is key to create a podcast episode that people listen and like, cool, like I added something to my day. I'm looking forward to the upcoming episode. But if you get lost, that's when people kind of like listen to shows and go, oh man, like they went all over the place. So not having clarity on the one thing that we want people to get out of this episode is going to really hurt us. So let's make sure that we have clarity, and that's a pro and not a con, right? So on the cons, I feel like a lot of people look at a competitor and think about like, or like just like do a competitive analysis, and they really try to replicate the recipe for success, which sometimes removes the excitement of creating a product that is actually more you. And so I want to invite you to really think about like, how can you use winning elements of other people's shows, but also incorporate stuff that it is you, especially even as you're trying to hone in like your host. You don't need to be a personality, but people are coming to you because you have a set of expertise that they really appreciate, and the way you deliver it is what keeps them coming back. So how can we create something that is honoring us as hosts, but also honoring the listener? So another con is that, and I see this here at the podcast space, and actually this was just mentioned on the newsletter that came out from Podcast Movement, The Noise Gate, that got released just yesterday, Tuesday, May 7th. And I'm talking about how when you pick a topic for your podcast, people eventually graduate from your content. So when they've reached the level of expertise that you're teaching, not all people will stay around, especially if you have a big catalog of content. I see that all the time. Around the mark of like 3 months, I have a dip in the numbers that I expected, and that is because probably it's around the time that someone has stopped consuming the content because they just don't have an interest in that topic anymore, or they graduated from the expertise that they were seeking. Think about it almost like levels. They got to the level that they needed, and now they're on to the next thing. Or in podcasting sometimes, because this is a podcast about podcasting, and I invite you to think about that a little bit. Like sometimes what happens is that people are excited about that thing that we do, but then they kind of like stop being interested about it. And this is where understanding your audience is key. And a lot of my audience are neurodivergent. So what that means is that they're super excited about the podcast. They do. They consume all the things. They learn all the stuff. And then they're like, oh, I'm burned out. Or I lost the energy to carry on doing these projects. So I need to take a break. I'm going to maybe like stop the podcast for a season or whatever, and then I come back to it. So I see those dips in audience engagement, and I know that it's time to, all right, work on alternative marketing strategies to capture new audiences. And then last but not least, I want to invite you to really think about, again, how have you looked at these podcasts? Do you think people are coming to your podcast because they care about you, the personality, or are they coming for the show? And so if you are someone who has really been feeling like you have a big personality and you're talking about all the things, but you're not talking about the business, or if you have this idea that you want to create a podcast that is like personality driven and you don't want it to be like about your business, but you really can't get comfortable in it, maybe it's time to assess why that is and how have people been looking for the topic or the personality. Like, which one do you think has the biggest purpose in everything that you're doing right now? So if you've been struggling to understanding how to leverage your podcast in a way that helps you not only achieve your business goals, but also help you stand out as an expert online and grow without overwhelm so that more people see the podcast, and also how to create a plan that will make podcasting more exciting for you, because at the end of the day, it's all about enjoying the process. So if so, go onto thepodcastspace.com and look through the services tab, because I have all the ways that you can work with me, whether that's podcast coaching, that's instant access courses, or if it is a podcast power hour. You can find all the links at thepodcastspace.com. I can only invite you to keep creating content that's imperfect, but moves you forward. Bye.